Have you ever, thrown your full energy behind a brilliant idea? Or maybe seen a social movement just ignite with incredible passion?
Oh, yeah.
Or even just watched a new initiative launch, big fanfare, everything, only for it to eventually, well, kind of lose its spark?
Mm-hmm. Happens all the time.
Or just struggles, right, to create that lasting, deep change everyone was hoping for. And it's so tempting, isn't it, to point fingers at the obvious opposition.
Loud critics, yeah.
Exactly, the act resistors, the people openly fighting it. But what if the biggest barrier isn't really that direct confrontation? What if it's something, I don't know, way more subtle, quiet, but maybe even more powerful?
That's a really interesting angle.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to unpack this fascinating and I think often overlooked concept that might just be that silent force. It's called cultural inertia.
Mm.
And it might be the single biggest barrier to progress. We're grounding our discussion today in a really compelling piece from Substack by Chris Abraham titled Fighting American Culture Inertia. Now, that article frames the challenge specifically around creating a more anti-racist America, which is obviously huge. But the insights, I think, they resonate much wider than just that one context.
Absolutely. The principles seem pretty universal.
So our mission today is basically to dig into this idea, pull out the key insights, maybe uncover some surprising truths about how societies actually change, or maybe more accurately, how they resist changing.
Yeah, that resistance is key.
And we want to offer you a shortcut to understanding this challenge because it's often misidentified, isn't it? We're diving into why these big societal shifts are just so incredibly difficult, even when, a lot of people might theoretically agree with the goals.
Even when there's apparent consensus.
Right. It's about more than fighting vocal opponents. It's about understanding and, well, ultimately figuring out how to move this whole system that just kind of prefers to stay put.
Likes its equilibrium.
Exactly. So let's jump in. Maybe we should start with the science. Where does this idea even come from?
Yeah, that's a great starting point. The author does a really nice job connecting this societal thing back to, well, basic physics. Inertia.
Right, from science class.
Exactly. In physics, inertia is just that property of any object, any physical thing that makes it resist changes to how it's moving or not moving.
Okay.
If something's still, it wants to stay still. If it's moving, it wants to keep moving, same speed, same direction, unless some outside force acts on it.
Like that classic example, the big boulder sitting on a flat field.
Perfect example.
It's not going to just decide to start rolling, is it? It stays there
Hmm.
until, I don't know, something massive pushes it, or there's an earthquake maybe.
Right, some significant external force is needed. Or think about a car on cruise control on a flat highway.
Okay.
You turn off the engine. It doesn't just instantly stop. It keeps rolling for a bit. It resists that change, that slowing down until friction, air resistance, the brakes finally overcome its momentum.
It's like this inherent stubbornness built into matter itself.
Precisely. And the beauty of using this physics analogy is it highlights that this resistance isn't something you can just wish away or ignore. It's fundamental.
It's not temporary.
No, it's a core property. And that intrinsic resistance to change is what makes inertia so powerful and often so frustrating if you're the one trying to initiate the change. It applies to everything. Atoms, galaxies, the whole lot.
Okay, so that makes sense for physical objects. But how do we take that concept and apply it to something as, well, squishy and abstract as culture or a whole society? How can that have weight or resistance?
Yeah, and that's the leap the source makes, and I think it makes it quite effectively. It argues that societies, just like physical objects, inherently prefer to stay as they are. They have their own kind of inertia.
Huh. Societal inertia.
Exactly. They resist change unless, just like that boulder or that car, enough energy, and we'll unpack what energy means in this context, but enough energy is consistently applied to nudge them or push them in a new direction.
So it's not just a metaphor. The piece is saying this is like a fundamental dynamic.
That's the argument, yes. It's presented as a core principle of how societies operate. And this is where the real challenge, the subtlety of cultural inertia, really hits you.
How so?
Because it's not usually a loud, angry opposition that you can point to and say, there's the problem. The source describes it as quiet, slow, and hard to notice.
Okay, quiet, slow, hard to notice. Not like a protest march.
Right. It's more like this pervasive atmosphere, a kind of deep-seated stillness that keeps old patterns alive. Think about how often a new law gets passed, maybe something really progressive about equality or fairness.
Yeah, big headlines, policy changes.
Right. On paper, the rules have changed. Overnight, sometimes. But the actual everyday stuff, the habits, the ingrained attitudes, the unspoken assumptions that law is trying to change,
It's way longer.
way, way longer. Because people just naturally tend to cling to routines. Why? Well, because it's just easier.
Easier than changing.
Yeah, even if those same people say, oh yeah, I agree with that new law, that's a good idea.
Mm.
There's a cognitive load, right? Learning new ways, adapting, challenging your own biases, it takes effort.
Mm.
It's simply less work to keep doing what you've always done.
So the legal framework might shift. Like the operating system gets an update saying do X now, but the underlying cultural apps are still running the old code whispering, yeah, but it's just easier to keep doing Y.
That's a great way to put it. And why continues, often kind of under the radar. Not necessarily out of defiance, maybe just apathy or comfortable habit.
Wow. The source really drives this point home, doesn't it? It says, culture has weight. That weight is inertia. That's a really powerful image.
Yes.
Picturing the sheer mass of all the established norms, the shared beliefs, collective memories, habits, all of it making up this society. It's not just individuals, it's this system with its own gravity.
It really is.
Yeah.
And looking at it that way helps explain why progress, even after you get those landmark legal wins or political victories, can feel so frustratingly slow. Like you're pushing that boulder uphill Sisyphus style.
Right.
People might intellectually agree, they might nod along, say the right things in a survey, but the actual friction of changing their daily lives, their workplaces, family dynamics, community interactions, it's often just too much effort without some kind of sustained push or incentive.
Which explains why old patterns seem to just creep back in. Or they stick around in slightly different forms, maybe less obvious ones.
Exactly. Even after big, well-intentioned efforts for change, that immense, subtle weight of culture is constantly, quietly, trying to pull things back to where they were, back to the path of least resistance.
Like trying to turn a giant supertanker. You can't just yank the wheel hard left and expect it to turn on a dime.
No, you need that persistent, deliberate force applied over a long, long time.
Okay, that's a really profound point. And it leads right into what the source calls the misunderstood opponent. Because usually when we talk about big societal changes, like the example used in the piece, creating a more anti-racist America, our go-to assumption, or at least what the media often focuses on, is that the main enemy is open hatred.
Right, the explicit stuff.
Yeah, we focus our energy, our attention on the really visible antagonists. Visible racists, white supremacists, hate groups. They're obvious, tangible, they make headlines, they provoke outrage, they feel like the target.
And this is where the source offers this, frankly, quite sobering reframing. It argues that these visible, loud forces, while incredibly harmful and needing to be addressed,
Of course.
they are actually, numerically speaking, small forces in the big picture.
Yeah.
They don't represent the bulk of society. The larger challenge, the article contends, is the vast weight of a society that does not want to move.
Wow.
That is the core of cultural inertia in action. It's not the active, shouting opposition that's the biggest hurdle. It's the quiet, passive, maybe even unconscious resistance of the vast majority. It's almost like a geological force. Slow, but immensely powerful.
Okay, so if we're not primarily fighting, the people waving hateful signs, who are we actually dealing with, this inertial majority? What do they look like?
The source paints a really clear picture, and it's almost, well, disarmingly normal. These are not extremists. They're not people deeply invested in the culture wars on either side.
They're activists.
No. Their lives, the source points out, revolve around things most people can relate to. Their jobs, their families, their hobbies, and maybe most importantly, a deep, almost instinctive desire to avoid conflict and maintain stability.
The quiet middle.
Pretty much. The vast quiet middle. And when you look at their behaviors, it becomes even clearer why traditional protest tactics or, confrontational approaches often don't move them. Well, the piece says they accept small changes they cannot avoid. Maybe a new HR policy at work or a new street sign. But crucially, they rarely lead them. They follow, they don't initiate.
Okay.
And this is a point activists often miss, according to the source. They are not moved by slogans or threats. A trending hashtag or an angry article isn't going to suddenly change their mind.
And shaming doesn't work either.
No, the source is very clear. They do not respond to shame. If anything, trying to shame them often backfires. It makes them dig in, creates resentment, not conversion. Their number one priority, overwhelmingly, is just stability.
They just want things to stay calm.
They hold still. They're not necessarily opposing progress out of malice. They just prefer not to be disrupted.
Yeah.
It's like a basic human instinct, almost like conserving energy. Stick to the familiar path, it's easier.
That statistic the source uses is really jarring, though. If 70 to 90% of the population is like this, I mean, that changes everything, doesn't it?
It completely reframes the task.
Yeah.
It means societal change isn't about defeating a small group of last opponents. That feels like a clear fight, good versus evil maybe.
Right, identifiable sides.
But if you're dealing with this vast, quiet majority,
Yeah.
it becomes a much more amorphous long-term challenge.
So the strategy has to be totally different.
Exactly. The implication is huge. The challenge shifts from defeating loud opponents, who are just one small part of the picture here, to finding energy to move the quiet majority that resists movement.
Okay.
That means the tactics, the way you communicate, the whole approach has to be different. If you're just shouting at or trying to shame 80% of people who just want to get on with their lives and feel overwhelmed already,
It's not going to
you're
work.
likely to fail. And you might even harden their resistance, make them less open next time. It becomes about persuasion, maybe invitation, rather than force or imposition.
And that shift in understanding helps explain why so many movements, even with great intentions and initial energy, seem to just stall out or fade away.
hmm This is where the piece gets really interesting, I think. It argues that movements often profoundly underestimate this silent, pervasive force, this inertia.
They think the idea is so good it'll just catch on by itself.
Exactly. They mistakenly believe that change, once you get it started with a big splash or a law passed, will sort of spread on its own. Like it has its own momentum just because it's right or logical.
But the source says,
Flat out, it does not.
ouch, that's a tough truth.
It is, but it's vital. If we want to get beyond these cycles of big hope followed by disillusionment, we have to face it.
So the consequence is, if you don't keep pushing.
Without energy, the source says, people stay where they are. Cultural inertia isn't just a static wall you break through once. It's like this constant, gentle pull backwards.
Gravity.
Yeah, always trying to bring everything back to stillness, back to the default. If that initial force, that burst of energy, fades even a little bit, it's like pushing something really heavy across a sticky floor.
The second you ease up.
It slows right down. That friction, that weight, pulls it back. It stops, sometimes surprisingly fast. The moment a movement takes its foot off the accelerator, the cultural system starts reverting.
And we can see this play out historically, can't we? The source uses some really vivid examples, like the civil rights movement in the U.S.
Right.
We celebrate, and rightly so, the huge legal victories. The Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, landmark stuff, changed the legal landscape completely. No more explicit segregation, legally.
Absolutely monumental legal shifts, no question.
Yeah.
But the source asks us to contrast that with the social attitudes, the lived realities on the ground.
Ah.
Those attitudes, the piece argues, shifted far more slowly.
Yeah.
Integration, legally mandated, still meant years of quiet resistance.
How did that resistance show up if it wasn't always overt hate?
Well, think about things like redlining. Banks, real estate agents finding ways to keep neighborhoods segregated through lending or property rules, even after it was technically illegal. Or how school districts were redrawn, or housing patterns subtly encouraged, that effectively resegregated schools without an explicit whites-only sign. The housing laws changed, yes, but as the source says, segregation remained through other means.
Through cultural habits, social norms, economic factors.
Exactly. The indirect, persistent effects of inertia. It really highlights that gap between de jure change the law on paper and de facto change what actually happens. The law moved fast, but the culture, it dragged its feet for decades.
Then fast forward a bit, Occupy Wall Street. I remember that vividly. The energy, the camps, the headlines about the 99%.
Huge global attention. Felt like a real moment.
It did. Felt like maybe something fundamental was shifting in how we talked about inequality.
But then, almost as quickly as it popped up, it faded.
Yeah.
It's a textbook example, according to this framework. A lack of sustained, consistent energy allows inertia to just reassert itself.
Yeah.
The initial push was strong, fueled by anger, frustration, but without that ongoing day-to-day strategic force. It couldn't maintain momentum against the sheer weight of the status quo. It didn't have the long-term structure to turn outrage into lasting change. It was a sprint, when cultural change is always a marathon.
And even more recently, Black Lives Matter. After George Floyd's murder, there was this incredible surge. Felt different, didn't it? Widespread awareness, corporations making statements, symbols changing.
A genuine sense of potential turning point for many?
Yeah. But the source points out even that lost momentum as attention shifted.
It just reiterates that pattern, doesn't it? Even strong movements stall when energy runs out. Inertia pulls everything back to stillness. It's this constant fundamental battle for anyone trying to make deep changes.
The default state is stillness. The preferred state is familiar patterns. It takes this immense continuous energy just to keep things moving forward.
And the moment public attention shifts, the media moves on, the pressure eases. That cultural weight starts pulling things back.
Which brings us to maybe a really crucial and maybe uncomfortable point about resistance itself. We tend to think pushback against change comes from malice, right? From hate or deep ideological anger.
That's the common assumption.
But the source suggests something different. It says simply, people do not like to be forced to move.
And that raises a really important question for all of us, I think. When people feel pushed hard by new laws, new social norms, public pressure, the source argues they resist not from hate, but from discomfort.
Discomfort, not hate.
That's the argument. They dig in when they feel threatened, or when their normal way of doing things is challenged. It's not necessarily about being a bad person or racist or sexist or whatever. It's about a very human, almost primal instinct to defend what feels normal.
Because what's familiar feels safe. New feels uncertain, maybe risky.
Exactly. And the source offers this really critical clarification. Activists often mistake this for active hostility. It is not. It is human nature to hold still when shoved.
Wow. That's a huge distinction. It reframes opposition not as an attack out of malice, but as a natural reaction to feeling disrupted, like protecting your own sense of equilibrium.
Yet preserving their mental and social landscape, it's self-preservation, in a way.
So that colleague who might quietly drag their feet on a new diversity initiative, or the neighbor who just shrugs off a community inclusion effort, they aren't necessarily acting out of hate.
Not necessarily. They might just be deeply uncomfortable with the change itself. With anything that feels like it's messing with their routine, their understanding of how things should be, their worldview, they're not saying, I hate this. They're maybe saying, I'm comfortable, and this feels like effort I didn't sign up for.
Okay. And then there's the other side of this coin, right? Apathy.
Yes, the source called apathy the other form of inertia. And it's maybe even more insidious because it's less visible than active resistance. It's quiet inaction.
How does that work?
Well, people might agree with the ideals in theory. They nod along, maybe sign an online petition, share a post, but then they do nothing to live them in their actual lives.
Back to old habits.
Exactly. The moment the spotlight moves or the pressure's off, they return to old habits. They actively avoid the friction of change. They're the ones who just sort of wait for the storm to pass, hoping the difficult conversations and the demands for effort will just go away.
And this widespread apathy, this quiet drift back to comfort, that's how progress erodes, even without anyone actively fighting it.
Precisely. It's not that people are malicious, it's just that the energy for the change dissipates. No one is actively pushing for it anymore once the initial surge fades. It's that constant, subtle, gravitational pullback to the familiar default.
Like trying to keep a boat pointed upstream in a current if you stop paddling.
You drift back down.
Oh.
Exactly. And societal currents, the pull of the status quo, are incredibly strong.
Okay, so given all this, that the main opponent might be quiet resistance, apathy, this deep-seated inertia, not just loud hate, how do we actually make lasting change happen? Because a lot of modern activism seems focused on symbols, right?
That's a key point the source addresses. Removing statues, renaming buildings, changing language to be more inclusive.
Things that make a statement.
They absolutely make statements. They signify evolving values, reject old norms. But the source offers a pretty critical, almost harsh analysis here.
Which is?
These actions make statements, but do not create momentum. And even more pointedly, it argues they can even strengthen inertia by making people defensive.
How could symbols strengthen inertia? That seems counterintuitive.
Well, if that inertial majority perceives a symbolic act not as progress, but as an attack on their history, their heritage, their identity, maybe even their family's stories. If it makes them feel like their world is being torn down without their input or consent, they might dig in harder. Not necessarily out of hate for the new symbol, but out of a perceived threat to their own sense of self and stability.
So they resist the change even more because of how it was presented?
Potentially, yes.
Yeah.
They aren't suddenly going to embrace the new ideal if they feel personally attacked or invalidated by the process. That digging in creates more resistance, reinforcing the inertia.
That's a really crucial critique. It suggests symbols matter, but they can't be the whole game.
Right. The source is blunt. Real change requires more than symbolic victories. It needs something that gets at the root cause, that inertia itself, not just the surface manifestations.
So what does work then? If symbols aren't enough, what does real change require, according to this perspective?
Connecting back to the core idea, real lasting change needs steady lasting force. Consistency over drama.
The marathon, not the sprint.
Exactly. Think less like explosions, more like water slowly shaping stone over time. And crucially, it needs stories and policies that invite people to move rather than ordering them to.
Invite, not order. That sounds different.
It highlights a proactive, persuasive approach, not a coercive one. Instead of just telling people they're wrong or shaming them or forcing compliance, it's about making the new way feel appealing, beneficial,
Yeah.
natural, maybe even easier in the long run than the old way.
Building bridges for that majority to cross instead of just yelling at them from the other side.
That's a good way to think about it, yeah.
And we've seen the opposite happen too, haven't we? Where progress doesn't just slow down, it actually seems to roll back. Sometimes quietly, until you suddenly realize ground has been lost.
hmm The source points to some really concerning contemporary examples, things still very much in the news. The rollback of affirmative action, weakening of voting protections, and resegregation of schools.
These are major shifts backwards.
Huge. And the critical point the source makes is why these happened. It argues they were not driven by loud hate. It wasn't primarily extremist groups achieving these policy changes through sheer force.
So what drove it then?
According to this analysis, they happened because energy faded and inertia reasserted itself. The sustained push for those protections and policies weakened over time.
The constant effort wasn't maintained.
Right. And the quiet, persistent pull of the old ways, the established systems, the comfortable defaults, it just gradually reasserted control. The collective sigh of relief when the pressure eased allowed these reversals to happen, often through complex legal or procedural means, not necessarily overt declarations.
So the message is stark. Without that constant effort, society just slides back to what's familiar, comfortable, easy.
People naturally return to easy patterns. And that final line from the source we keep coming back to, the weight of culture holds. It's always there, always pulling back to stillness, to the default. It's not a force you defeat once, it's something you have to perpetually manage, counteract.
Which brings us right back to the core challenge for anyone trying to make real change. The source says movements must accept this truth. Its biggest opponent is not the extremist, but the mass that resists motion.
And that resistance, as we've discussed, is typically quiet and stubborn, and fundamentally, crucially, not born of anger, but of human nature. It's just how we are, collectively. Understanding that changes the whole game plan, doesn't it?
It really does. So if the biggest hurdle isn't shouting enemies, but this quiet preference for staying put, this inherent resistance to being moved, how do we overcome it? What is the path forward for making change that actually sticks?
Well, the source lays out a method. It's clear, but it's definitely not easy. Movements must apply steady force.
Steady force, consistent pressure.
Yes. Not one big shove, not just flashy campaigns. Continuous, consistent pressure, like a slow geological process. And they must strive to make change feel like evolution, not disruption.
Evolution, not disruption. How do you do that?
It means integrating new ideas, new practices, in ways that feel more organic, less threatening to that inertial majority. Building those pathways we talked about, making the new way seem like a natural progression, maybe even easier or more beneficial eventually.
So it becomes less scary.
Less scary, more appealing. The ultimate goal, and this is absolutely key, is to turn ideals into habits that last.
Habits.
But once something becomes a habit, once it feels normal, automatic, effortless, just the way things are done, then it becomes part of the culture's inertia itself. But now, working in the new desired direction.
So you're essentially rewiring the cultural default setting.
Exactly. Not just applying patches, but changing the underlying operating system over time.
And the source is clear. This is hard work.
Oh yeah. It concludes this is harder than fighting hate. It's not as dramatic, doesn't grab headlines the same way. It is the slow, patient work of applying enough energy for long enough to shift the weight of a culture that prefers to stay where it is.
It's that marathon again. Sustained, thoughtful effort, not just emotional reaction.
It requires incredible persistence, empathy, and a really deep understanding of human nature and social dynamics.
It means recognizing the real battle isn't always against the visible enemy shouting insults, but often against those invisible currents of familiarity and comfort that keep pulling us back to where we've always been.
That's the essence of overcoming cultural inertia.
Cultural inertia. It doesn't shout, it doesn't march, but it holds everything in place with this immense quiet power. Understanding this force, this silent opponent, seems absolutely critical for anyone who cares about making genuine, lasting progress in any field, really.
Racial justice, climate change, even just changing how your team works at the office.
Yeah, if we keep misidentifying the main source of resistance, focusing only on the loud stuff, we're just going to keep getting frustrated when things don't fundamentally change around.
Seems likely, yes.
So, okay, let's bring this home. What does this all mean for you listening right now? As you go about your day, maybe you're thinking about movements you support, initiatives at work, or even just changes you'd like to see in your own community, your family. Consider where things might feel stalled. Is
hmm
it really because of loud, active, hateful opposition blocking the path? Or could it be, at least partly, this subtle, persistent force of cultural inertia, that quiet majority, maybe even including parts of ourselves, sometimes just preferring to hold still?
It's a different lens to look
It
through.
really is. So think about it. What might steady force look like in those specific situations? What kind of invitation to change, not an order, could genuinely help turn those ideals into lasting habits? How could you make the new path feel less like a scary disruption and more like a natural, maybe even easier evolution? It's a different way of thinking about progress, and maybe, just maybe, it holds a key to unlocking real, enduring change.